Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Pat, for your excellent introduction to the issues that are facing Melbourne and the kind of large-scale thinking that we need in order to address some of the problems that are obviously facing our cities and are becoming more and more pressing every day. I want to talk about a few things, but first of all, just to introduce the RMIT Urban Futures ECP, which Martin has talked about. It's collaborative research in transformative solutions to today's and future complex and urban challenges. And it really brings together all the different disciplines across the university which are addressing issues to do with the city in their different ways through their own lenses, with the intention of finding truly synthetic solutions that can draw upon the expertise of all those disciplines together. So that includes social scientists, engineers, economists, planners, people involved in policy, and given it's Design Week, also designers. So one of the things I'd like to talk about briefly is to talk a little bit about what role designers might play in the kind of large-scale urban questions that we'll be addressing. So here's the challenge. Based on current population projections, and there's no reason to think that they're going to change given the Prime Minister's announcement that they'll be cut, but by 2,000 people. Immigration will be cut by only 2,000 people next year. I think we can reasonably and indeed prudently plan for 11 more Canberras to be, the equivalent of 11 more Canberras to be introduced into Melbourne. I thought it'd be interesting to really just compare, do a little bit of a then and now, and there are a few reasons for doing this. On the left, I think, is 1985, and on the right is the Google Maps, our best cut at the same view. And I think what we can see is just this explosion of growth, most of which is residential within the city of Melbourne. And I think one of the things which is interesting to ponder here is to the extent in which we were able to plan and predict this kind of growth. I mean, I recall in my early stages, in my early career as an architect, where we were proposing medium density or indeed high-rise housing. And as recently as the 90s, it was seen as an impossibility. And it was seen as an impossibility because no one would live in that mode of housing. And what we see has grown, of course, facilitated by immigration, by the success of our university sectors, by the City of Melbourne's Postcode 3000 initiatives, and a whole set of other conditions. We've seen this, what was an entirely alien typology, come to increasingly dominate the very centre of Melbourne. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the other point is really looking at Melbourne from afar and wondering whether the way that Melbourne is growing is in any way optimal. And Pat made the point, and I think it's important to emphasise that the growth has been largely within the central zone of Melbourne, where it's possible to construct high-rise towers. And on the periphery of the city, it's very much been business as usual. And this is business as usual, which goes back to the early part of last century, where it was individual, detached, 12 dwellings per hectare. And that's what continues, and that's what grows out from the edge of Melbourne. And of course, what we're confronting is the issue of congestion. So the difference between the white contour here and the edge of the blue area marks the distance that one can travel within the same time period at peak and non-peak hours. So this is just starting to give an indication of the limits to the model that we currently understand. And it's really suggesting that that there are limits to the way that we can continue with the current model. So I think one of the questions that underlies this discussion is really whether what we're doing is broken and what we're going to do about it. And I think one of the questions for designers comes with this question of confronting the greenfield, because architects, urban designers have been focused very much on the growth which is happening in the centre of the city, and they need to because of the complexity. But much of what we're seeing is happening almost independent of a design or a strategic vision, and that's happening on the edge of the city. But nevertheless, because of the reduction in the amount of sites which are occupiable with high density development and the difficulties in redeveloping the middle zones of Melbourne, we'll need to look again at greenfield solutions. Just to finish off this piece on the role for design in addressing this large-scale urban questions, when we see people like Billy Giles Corti who are working and producing really strong empirical evidence based on the analysis of the existing city, and we have a series of strong policy propositions and also a set of technical solutions which are being promised, it seems that the role of design is in these areas. So I think synthesis is one of the critical things that designers always do. They bring together a set of competing requirements into a solution which tries to satisfy all of them in the most satisfying way possible. And I think that in a multidisciplinary team is really a core role of the designers. There's envisaging and modelling, so there's actually seeing what is being proposed in a way which can be directly apprehended. There's testing a set of formulations and propositions that might come from somewhere else, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Proposing, and indeed generating a social licence for a transformed city. I wanted to look just briefly, and this is looking at the designers in the audience, and just to go back to a time where there are a set of bold urban propositions that were put forward, and this is of course Le Corbusier in the 20th century. Now these kind of propositions were so maligned in the I think originally in the battles between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses that were carried out in the 60s and the 70s. I think that's led in many ways to a retreat of the scope of the design professions and what they can comment and propose. So there's no question that this model of the tower block that was put forward was a vision which has become fulfilled in all the horror that we now know. So the question for us is, what are the new models that we can propose that can have similar purchase and ability to transform the city? And again, Kenzo Tange and Tokyo Bay. And so there are architectural models for this. This is Kirsten Thompson's Napier Street Housing. It's an infill development in Fitzroy. It really does, it really is regarded as a successful model that increases density and draws on all the local amenity and reflects that in its form and the rethinking of the function of these developments. But I think one of the questions which is really pressing for us is how can these solutions, and I know that Jen will be talking about Nightingale in a little while, how can these kind of solutions that work well in the inner city areas be scaled up to the extent that we need to consider it? So beginning as an architect, there's this question of what is the city? And I think architects tend to think, oh, well, it's just buildings multiplied. Beginning to think about it much more deeply in terms of the opportunities for living and working that are provided by the city, and seeing the city as an organism and a support system that can really lead us to a rich, healthy life, changes this perspective away from questions of form and propriety and bring us towards something else. And so the beginning of my journey to try and understand cities was looking at this idea of connectivity and trying to think of what that actually meant. Now, this is very abstract and I'm sure somewhat confronting, but I'll try and explain it very quickly. This is a very simple model of a city, and the numbers, each of the grid squares are a site, and the numbers in each of the grids represent the travel time between that particular grid square and all the others within the city. So it's really a proxy for connectivity. And there are some interesting things that you notice. So if you look at the 40 in the middle, which is the very central place within my model city, and the diagonal corners, you can see that there's a substantial decrease in the amount of connectivity between those different locations within the city. And that means that even if something were as well connected by rail, there would still be an enormous penalty in travel time in order to be able to reach anywhere else to do any of the things that one might want to do within the city. So the periphery is always going to be substantially disadvantaged. And the other thing to note is how this gets worse as we go further and further. And I think Melbourne's getting to a point where the edge is now so far away from the centre that it's becoming increasingly difficult to enjoy the metropolitan benefits which are offered by the city itself. So this was something that we developed further in the abstract into a computer model and put against that the, I think that's going to work, the notion that building, that more valuable sites are better connected and that building taller buildings is more expensive per square metre. And putting just those two things together with the connectivity of a graph lets us model overall urban forms and explore a whole set of things. And here we're exploring what happens when we make fast connections within the city, and you can see that these better connected and therefore denser areas follow. Now there's a whole lot of work that follows from that, but I'm not going to go into it in detail. And so this is work that we were doing with students and also in collaboration with New Rail that was exploring this thought experiment of what a city of 300,000 people connected by fast rail to 22 minutes from the CBD on a greenfield site with 35 dwellings per hectare might look like. And to explore these qualities of sustainability, desirability, prosperity and health. And so this is the same model that we saw before, but here growing a city, if you like, across a much more complex topographical and grid of transport connections. And so the purpose here is really to generate a set of diversity, a set of different densities, a set of different housing possibilities which aren't available within the Melbourne metropolitan area itself. And then we drilled down into that and started looking with the students at what the key attributes might be within that density map which has been generated. And then explore a whole set of different urban forms. So 35 dwellings per hectare, for example, is talked about as desirable, but there are so many different ways of generating that density within the city. And so these are the kind of things, that questions that design can start to explore. And I think you can see implicit in this like a whole set of choices around how one might live and work within a new greenfield city. And I think one of the key questions in this work is this question: if we build, will they come? And so really to answer that, we need to start to design in some detail and envisage what these streets might be. So this is further work that we've done, really exploring what these different densities might offer in terms of new possibilities for living within the city. So here we are at 50 dwellings per hectare, and that's a net measure, is this kind of urban fabric and interactivity becomes possible. The one before was 35, and then this is at 105 dwellings per hectare with a much denser thing. And I want to just move quickly. It's always perilous presenting the work of colleagues, but I want to look at this, and this was taking a completely different design perspective. This is the work of Mark Jark, looking, start really beginning with from a landscape perspective and looking at the ground and what is present as being one of the fundamental drivers. And he's looking at issues such as how infrastructure in a very broad scale can be a prompt for different kinds of, he calls, new civic armatures, open spaces, and supercharge the development by really working with the character of the land and green opportunities within the new city. I'm going to move through it for reasons of time. And he looked at methods of extracting density and different kinds of urban form from existing fabric and combining those together around these urban armatures, the idea of the 20-minute city represented as circles, and developing a whole set of urban propositions around those ideas. Looking at issues of program and how both lifestyle and productivity can be supported. And then I'll finish with this, which is this morning's Herald Sun. So this thing got real with respect to Geelong. It's a 32-minute trip. We're thinking 20 minutes is better, but ScoMo's prepared to go 200 kilometres an hour, no faster. And this is the proposition that we're looking at. So what I'd like to explore in the panels is how this kind of scenario that we're talking about, analogous to the map and the thinking that we saw earlier, might be explored around the specific areas of Geelong and opening particularly this area along Corio, between Corio and Avalon, and bringing all those characteristics of productivity, health, sustainability to a really new form of urban fabric that might exist in these areas. Okay, thank you all.